Everyone who loves fighting games has thought about their dream installment in one of their favorite franchises and what characters it would include. And if the last few years have taught us anything, it's that your absurd, pie in the sky, greatest wishes are entirely possible. Short of Goku and Smash. I mean, give me a fucking break. I love building fake fighting game rosters, especially placing myself under unnecessary real life parameters and limits. It almost feels like a puzzle filling certain niches and fulfilling different necessitated units of representation for both the audience appeal and a balanced meta. And this spring's sort of unexpected explosion of fighting game flares ignited in every corner got precisely those juices flowing in my little head, and I wanted to expose you to my twisted process of building a fake fighting game roster. I found myself inclined to give some thought to my dream draft of a Marvel vs. Capcom game, one of the best trilogies of crossover fighters ever, and also one last installment we don't talk about. Crossovers like Marvel vs. Capcom sometimes have an especially volatile conversation as to who should make the cut, similarly to something like, say, Smash. This is a matter of picking characters to represent an IP within a series. It's sort of a badge of honor to represent in a crossover, and it's understandable everyone wants their favorite to be the recipient of that honor. And in universes as huge as Marvel and Capcom, this is of course not easy to narrow down. I could just dump the toy box and narrow down from there, but holy smokes, where do I begin? I was struck by inspiration courtesy of the King of Fighters games as to balancing representation and IP with all these different franchises. Like the Marvel vs. Capcom games, KOF involves choosing a team of 3 fighters, with the added perk that every character has 2 concrete canonical teammates, the character's tournament companions within the canonical story. You can mix and match a team however you like, but playing a canonical team is what earns you the robust story content and endings. I wondered what a Marvel vs. Capcom roster would look like if I applied a similar mentality. It's always a fuss to decide how much representation to put into a crossover. Too much X-Men this, too much Street Fighter that, too much Fire Emblem. Oh, crap, that's the wrong one again. But if I apply a different practice of dividing characters into small teams to represent those corners of Marvel and Capcom, that perfect point between the wild eclecticism of a crossover and a necessary balance may come together nicely. I wound up with 16 teams of 3 fighters each, 8 Marvel and Capcom, which seems like a ton, but that only comes out to 48 fighters, too short of the roster of Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So I don't think it's at all unreasonable. These characters are divided into small teams of 3, each team having story stuffs potentially to seek out the game's big bad crossover villain, who we'll cover at the end. Let's start with the Marvel side, with the quintessential team among them all. Picking a trio of Iron Man, Captain America, and Hulk lets you play the story of Team Avengers. Again, you can play any of those characters in a team with anyone else in this video, but assembling Team Avengers is what earns you their personalized story content, and they may be the starting team that requires the least explanation. It's the big boys themselves. One of the many reasons we don't talk about Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite is because of how badly the X-Men characters were snubbed. Considering Capcom's relationship with Marvel began with X-Men, it was a fucking insult that not a single one came back for Infinite, so I want to bring them back in a big way. Putting together a team of Wolverine, Deadpool, and Cable creates Team Mutant. These 3 have a cool vibe together, representing different eras and corner of X-Men and the Marvel vs. Capcom series. I found myself mourning the potential of a more traditional X-Men team, but I found places to scratch that itch elsewhere. How about the space alien adjacent corners of Marvel? Returning once more would be Thor, Captain Marvel, and Gamora, forming Team Mighty. The sort of pseudo-guardians kinda speak for themselves. I knew next a Spider-Man themed team would need to be in order, and I tooled around with his street buddy types in the New York related corners of Marvel, but a lot of those characters just feel very punchy and gunny in a way that might not be super interesting in a game as bombastic as Marvel vs. Capcom. I want to think of Spidey's broader history, and I recalled the Uncanny Avengers, a team-up mixer of the Avengers and the X-Men, of which Spider-Man was a part of. And from there, a team alongside Rogue and Iceman came together. This felt weirdly organic. Spider-Man and Iceman have history from the Amazing Friends, and Iceman and Rogue were close in the X-Men movies. A team setup like this altogether references the histories of X-Men, Avengers, and Spider-Man without being overtly flavored in any one way, and I really like how that came out. A big elephant in the room with Capcom's handling of Marvel is the weird neglect of the Fantastic Four. I suppose ultimately they just aren't very interesting fighting game characters, and there's often other characters who make them redundant. Thing kicks ass and all, but we have Hulk after all. That said, the Fantastic Four has a rich history of zany, rotating door team members, and I thought of a less straightforward team. All about that history could be fun. I decided to pluck one conventional member of the four to make history and become playable, and Human Torch made the most sense to me from his quick-witted personality to strong and fun powers, and I gave him his teammates in the form of Black Panther and Storm, who have history with the Fantastic Four and with each other. Team Fantastic might seem a little offbeat, but I think it's another good compromise to shout out the connections between Wakanda and the Fantastic Four, again without feeling entirely saturated one way. How about the Defenders? Doctor Strange and Ghost Rider are two of the Marvel vs. Capcom series' most welcome newcomers back in the third game, who should round out their particular corner of Marvel's darker vibes though. My choice is a little esoteric, but I think a perfect third for Team Defenders would be Red Harpy. For the uninitiated, Red Harpy is Betty Ross, the love interest of Bruce Banner, who herself got exposed to Gamma like her boy toy, which turns her into a red demonic gargoyle. She's an incredibly cool and underrated character who has history in the Defenders team, and I also really like how her presence alongside Ghost Rider and Strange can act as sort of a spiritual shout out to the fact that Hulk himself was a founding Defender. Now, I know this roster smells a lot like Hero right now, so I, of course, had to relegate a villains team. Doctor Doom and Venom were no-brainers, two of Marvel's coolest villains with a lot of legacy in the Capcom games. And the third is a villain whose absence is another huge blind spot in Capcom's crossover so far, none other than Loki. Even before his meteoric rise to popularity as of recent adaptations, I'm a little shocked Capcom has never wanted to try a take on Loki. He'd be insanely fun in a fighting game. My only regret was that Magneto feels a little left out of the party. But maybe it's time he had a successor in the context of Marvel vs. Capcom. What if Magneto's successor, in terms of gameplay meta and some shared animations, could be Scarlet Witch? After all, Wanda, like Loki, has a lot of renewed interest and some incredibly fun moveset potential. And her team practically builds itself. Let's have her bring together Quicksilver and Vision for Team Wanda. Pietro gets written off a lot, but the Flash in Injustice proves a speedster in a fighting game can be super fun, and it's about time he got his dues. And Vision has potential to be one of the most powerful combatants ever in this series. Now let's shift over to the Capcom side. Much like how each team in Marvel represented a world or team of Marvel's history, the Capcom teams would represent one of Capcom's IPs or genres. Right off the bat, there's got to be a Street Fighter team, and Ryu, Alex, and Luke come together pretty intuitively as the characters postured as different protagonists of different installments of arguably Capcom's most famous series. But how could Stryker exclude his own favorite Chun-Li, you may ask? Hold that thought. A Mega Man team was easy money too, and you can cherry-pick which Mega Man timelines to assemble so everyone is happy. If we have the original Mega Man, Zero to represent the X series, and Tron back to step in for Legends, we have a diverse Mega Man team with beloved characters representing some of the biggest eras of Mega Man without just teaming up 3 Blue Bombers. You know I couldn't leave here without a Devil May Cry team. Let's have the most dysfunctional family road trip ever and team up Dante, Nero, and Virgil. Speaking of demons, I'm gonna do what Capcom would never and acknowledge Darkstalkers as important. Morgan and Felicia are practically givens. The third character would be less so. I'd personally vouch for BB Hood. I just really want a generation of fighting gamers, like yours truly did at a young age, to have the experience of picking her with no idea what to expect and just lose their minds when she pulls out a Glock. Now, there's actually a handful of Capcom games about slaying zombies in particular, so let's represent Resident Evil, Dead Rising, and Ghosts and Goblins all at once. Leon Kennedy, Frank West, and Sir Arthur form Team Zombie Slayers. Leon in particular I think is overdue for a crossover debut. Chris and Jill are cool and all, but come on, Leon is a great change of pace, and Resident Evil 4 being unrepresented in the series so far is just criminal. On a more offbeat note, Amaterasu is a character I was pretty scorned that Infinite left out. My mind went to characters who feel in tune with Japanese myth, and a quick option for a teammate was Strider Hiryu. That guy just rules. My last choice for this team is a little out there. So some Monster Hunter rep feels necessary, but truth be told, I hardly know the first thing about Monster Hunter. I could just shrug and say that the Monster Hunter from Infinite could return, but I couldn't help but just stretch out of my lane and do something a bit silly. What if Kogarashi from Monster Hunter Rise was playable? He refers to having a history of going on hunts, so he can represent the game's aspects of partner familiar creatures as well as straightforward weapons in hunting. And most importantly, I'm just really tickled by giving Strider a team that's a dog and a cat, since he's always surrounded by animals. This is easily the strangest team here, but I kinda like that about it. My next team is my favorite. Remember that pin we put in Chun-Li? I put her in a team here, with Lucia and Akira. This sounds like a second Street Fighter team, as it was inspired by their appearances in Street Fighter V, but it's actually a deceptively eclectic assembly, since Lucia originated from Final Fight, and Akira from rival schools long before they crossed into Street Fighter. So it's not only a badass girl squad, but an assembly of Capcom's history of crossover all in one place, and I'm just really happy with how this turned out in that regard. They're absolutely the quote-unquote canon team I like the most that I've made for this silly video. Finally, you aren't a Capcom fanboy if you aren't moaning about the characters that have been neglected for ages, and this team is all about that. Let's assemble the long-absent Captain Commando, Beautiful Joe, and new to the Versus series, Edward Falcon from Power Stone. I just miss these candy-colored goofballs, and they have a superhero vibe that fits together well, and I think this one is just super necessary. So this is our pretty roster. Our character select would look something like this. But what's the story? Why are all these intrepid trios of warriors gathering? We need a boss. Now, for all of its super lame aspects, combining Ultron and Sigma was a stroke of genius on part of Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. As great as Galactus was in Marvel 3, it always felt unfair when the final boss was just a Marvel guy in a Marvel vs. Capcom game. I wanted to do a similar fusion to Ultron Sigma. What if M. Bison, in his endless search for a new body, possesses with his great evil one of the great good hearts of Marvel, Charles Xavier? You could have this insane aura and power by combining psycho power with Xavier's peerless psychic power and give him an over the top bad guy name, Bison X. Let's return Bison to his glory as a big bad boss hoisted by his near polar opposite in the Marvel Universe, just as Xavier kinda did for Onslaught in the original Marvel vs. Capcom. It could all come full circle while serving as a bit more of a crossover. That's my roster mock-up for Marvel vs. Capcom 4, a total armchair thing from a guy inexperienced in the video game design industry. If you liked my roster, I really hope you leave a comment and say so. If you disagree, feel free to say who you think I'm missing too. There's always room for DLC. This was not easy to narrow down. There's always room for more. And hey, this roster can't hurt you. It's never going to be real. So, what would your adjustments be if it was your fantasy thing coming to life? I hope that if this was the roster for Marvel vs. Capcom 4, you'd at least insert coin and give it a chance. Thanks for watching, otherwise, and have a nice rest of your day. Here's to a new Marvel vs. Capcom game that isn't stupid.